Yeah, so my presentation today is going to be focused on our research here at Oregon State, which is, I recognize, a different climate, different soils than what you all have in Washington, and dry farming is really contingent on soil and climate. So, what I have learned might not all necessarily apply to your growing conditions, but I'm going to share what I have anyway, and hopefully we can learn together. And as you go through this project, you'll have a better idea of, you know, what what works in your environment, what you can take away from the work that I've done. You already introduced me a little about me, fourth generation dry farmer. Started working in 2004 on vineyards. I've been dry farming with OSU for 7 years. I'm a co-author on seven peer-reviewed publications on dry farming. That's five research articles, one which is currently in press, and then two extension pubs, one that's in press. So those two should be released in the next month or so. And then actually, funny story, I used to live in Duval. I worked at Oxbow Farm when I was in grad school as the Oxbow fellow, and I lived in the Oxbow condo and biked over to work. And I got to recently present with Anthony on the San Juan Island and chat with him a bit about our, because we both worked at Oxbow. So that's a fun little bit of trivia about me. So now I'm going to get into the meat of the presentation, and I wanted to start with a definition of dry farming. And I see a lot of definitions out there for what a dry farm tomato is. For me personally, the way that I want to define a dry farm tomato is that it is never irrigated. And, any of the dry farm crops, they're not irrigated. You're not using irrigation. I know that Amy at the Dry Farm Institute wants to be a little more open to maybe some early season irrigation, some supplemental irrigation to get the plants established, maybe one or irrigation. But for me, no irrigation. If I'm irrigating the crop, it's because I messed up somewhere, either with the field prep or something like that. So sometimes I do have to irrigate, but for me, the goal is not to. And then I was recently listening to a podcast with a grower down in Southern Oregon, in Rogue River, and she was saying that for her, a dry farm tomato, they do them in high tunnels, they irrigate until the first fruit set. And that sounds a lot like an irrigated tomato, but she was calling them dry farmed. So there's a lot of definitions out there for what even a dry farmed vegetable is. Um, Another one that I was reading out of California, a lot of the growers down there, they define a dry farm tomato as being small, thick-skinned, and intensely flavored. And for them, that's actually more important than how they produce the tomato. It's that quality. And if they grow a tomato without irrigation, but it doesn't have these traits, then they don't really want to sell it as a dry farm tomato because, it might hurt that brand. And so the flavor is really important as well. In my experience here in Western Oregon, we get about 20 to 30 tons per acre of total yield for these tomatoes. That's the gross yield. Unfortunately, the amount that you'll be able to sell will be lower than that because the tomatoes get blemishes, and these blemishes are caused by drought stress. So it's going to be things like blossom end rot or sun scald or things like that. That research article I was talking about, the dry farm tomato experiences, where people are talking about what their definition of a dry farm tomato is. We have a couple farmers here. We have Farmer I saying, I'm in the camp of legit. I only call it dry farmed if it's truly dry farmed. If not, I would say minimally irrigated. Then you have Farmer G saying, if you're telling me you're dry farming it and it tastes like water, then you're not dry farming. So it's that, is it the practices that make it dry farmed, or is it the outcomes? And for the California farmers, they don't necessarily agree on that. And that might explain why there's so many different definitions of what a dry farm tomato is. Why would you be interested in dry farming? I think first it's important to explain why you might not want to consider dry farming. And the first thing, and I think this is super important, especially for you all in Washington, is that high tunnel tomatoes are earlier. If you grow in a high tunnel, you're going to get your fruit in June, maybe July. These earlier tomatoes are easier to sell. You can sell them for more money at the farmer's market. And so you want those early tomatoes if you're a tomato grower. And if you dry farm, they're going to be later because you have to grow them outdoors in open fields. You can't dry farm in a high tunnel because you need that rain to fill up the soil and make it so that the crops have residual soil moisture to grow on. Another thing we already talked a bit about is the yields are lower for processed tomato production in Central California. They expect about 50 tons per acre, and we're saying 20 to 30 minus whatever you lose to blemishes. And again, you get increased blemishes, so more tomatoes with blossom end rot, with sun scald, with yellow shoulder, cracking, and you're gonna have to sort these, tomatoes out. They're actually more expensive to produce per ton, and we're going to go through an enterprise budget, but the big reason for this is basically yields are lower, and so, the same amount of cost in planting and in buying the plant starts, buying the fertilizer, those are the same for irrigated and dry farmed tomatoes, but so you end up with, those lower yields result in more expensive tomatoes. But there are some potential reasons to dry farm, and one of the big ones is increased marketability, especially during peak season. This is from that Sokolar paper again, and it's worth having less to have the best because you're getting new customers and you're trying to grow your base. And so you can get customers in at the farmers market. They want your dry farm tomato. Maybe they start buying other things from you as well. I know that Anthony at Oxbow has talked about how he sees about a dollar price premium for the dry farm tomatoes. So people are willing to spend more on them. And he also told me that they sell them all, that they have no trouble selling dry farm tomatoes. Another reason why farmers might want to consider dry farming is that it's a method of organic weed control. If dry farm one year, it's a lot easier to control the weeds. You deplete that weed seed bank, and then if you grow an irrigated crop in next year in your rotation, it might be easier to grow because you'll have fewer weeds. And then there's also water conservation and environmental concerns. I know that Anthony was telling me that for him, it's a really important thing too, is that it's less work per acre. They're easier to manage. So I'm going to go through some of the blemishes of dry farm tomato. The big one that I see a lot is blossom end rot. On some farms, no blossom end rot. On some farms, up to 90% blossom end rot. So, this can be a huge issue for dry farmers. Sometimes it's very light. I was watching a video recently of the Dirty Girl Produce guy in California, and he calls this blossom in sparkles. He's trying to rebrand blossom in rot if it's light like this is something desirable, I guess. And but this is definitely what you don't want. These tomatoes completely unmarketable. These tomatoes, maybe you can market them at a farmer's market, start calling them blossom in sparkles. Yellow shoulders is another blemish. It's a ripening disorder. Um, so this is probably unmarketable. I was talking to a grower here in Oregon. I showed him these tomatoes, and he said that he would be able to sell these sort of lightly yellow-shouldered tomatoes. Um, and the yellow shoulder is related to a trait in tomatoes called uneven ripening, where basically the tops of the tomatoes they're green when they're immature, and they've actually developed tomatoes that have an even ripening gene where they are much less susceptible to yellow shoulders. But unfortunately, those tomatoes don't taste as good. Having this uneven ripening gene, having these green shoulders when the fruit are immature, it increases the chlorophyll content of the fruit, and so they become sweeter when they ripen. So it's kind of a conundrum for growers. If you want to avoid the yellow shoulders, but you want sweet fruit, which is more important to you, I think that the sweet fruit is more important for most dry farmers. Internal whitening is another ripening disorder. It's similar to yellow shoulders, except it's inside of the fruit, and so you don't see it until you cut into it. Sun scald is another issue associated with heat and direct sun on the fruit. And this seems to be worse in dry farm tomatoes because you have less foliage to protect the fruit. The plants are smaller and they don't, have the same amount of leaves to cover the fruit. So you can see here, this was during a heat wave. I took this photo. Uh, I think we had about 4 days of 100-degree temperatures, and it just burned all the exposed fruit where you were getting direct sunlight on this fruit. And then splitting and cracking are other issues, and all of these blemishes are worse for dry farm tomato. Either they're a result of the plant stress or smaller plants, etc. For melons, the big issue that I see with dry farm melons is cracking. I got lots of photos of different melons with cracks in them. You can imagine that these would not be marketable. I have a farmer I work with here in Corvallis who calls these neighbor melons because he gives them to his neighbors. Another thing we see is this scarring where we have, I think this is caused by the cucumber beetle. They'll leave these little blemishes on the fruit. There's some cracks on here too, I know, but you can see these like scars. I don't know if those are marketable, but it's something that happens. And then you also get blossom end rot in melons, though this is super rare. I've only ever seen this in these like elongated watermelons called a Charleston Gray. So this is actually a picture of a squash, of a winter squash, but I have seen this in watermelons. I guess I don't have a photo of it. The other thing with melons is that certain varieties are susceptible to developing these really weird off flavors. Um, I noticed this especially in the Charente types and the cantaloupes, where they can be, kind of they taste like meat or metal or weird. So, if a variety is susceptible to these off flavors, then that might be one that you'd want to avoid because you don't want to send people home with that. And then picking too early can be an issue. And if you pick a melon, it's not going to get any sweeter. You're basically cutting off the sugar flow into the fruit. It's not like a winter squash where when you store a winter squash, those more complex carbohydrates turn to sugar. With a melon, as soon as you remove it from the plant, that sets your sugar levels. And so I know people are tempted to pick really early, but you can make a less sweet fruit that way. So some of the important things you need to consider as a dry farmer, the first and most important thing is your site suitable for dry farming? And this is highly dependent on your soil. Um, so the optimal soil is probably a silt loam or a silty clay loam. These have really high water holding capacity. So the amount of water that a soil can store is based on the particle size distribution. So the sandy soils don't hold enough water. The really clay soils, they hold a lot of water, but that water isn't necessarily available to the plants. So the ideal soil is a deep silt loam or silty clay loam. The soil pH for tomato is ideally between 5.5 and 6.5. I don't remember what it is for melons. And then you want sufficient soil nutrients. You don't want to have a whole bunch of nutrients. Like you don't want the soil to be extremely nutrient rich with tomato that can actually cause blossom end rot. But you don't want to have so few nutrients that the plants look like this. So this was a trial that we did, a fertility trial we did on a farm. This was former pasture. And the soil test here was really bad. It was 4.5 soil pH, 1 part per million phosphorus. So super low soil availability. When we put fertilizer down, it increased the plant size. This is the exception. On most sites, I don't see any effect of fertilizer on plant size or on yield. There are effects of fertilizer, though, on blossom end rot and on tomato flavor. Air temperature is super important. You want to be between 50 degrees Fahrenheit at night and 87 during the day. If it's too hot, if you get these big heat waves, then that can cause sun scalding in your tomatoes. So again, I took this photo in July, 4 days of 100-degree weather, burned all these fruits, made them unmarketable. Vapor pressure deficit is basically the dryness of the air. This drives how much water the plants use and can make them more drought stressed. So ideally, you don't want this air to be too hot and dry, which shouldn't be too much of a problem for all of you in Washington. At least it'll be less of a problem than it is down here. And then growing degree days are really important. So is the air warm enough to mature your crop in time to take it to market? And there's great growing degree day models at crop time. I'm going to go through them a little bit here in a sec. So looking at the climate differences between Oregon and Washington, it looks like we get about the same amount of annual precipitation. So these maps show the 30-year average for annual precipitation. It's about the same in the Puget Sound area as the Willamette Valley. It's actually a little bit drier where you guys are in Port Townsend. I think you get that rain shadow effect off of the Olympic Peninsula, the Olympic Mountain Range. So here's the vapor pressure deficit, and you can see In August, it's definitely a little hotter and drier in the Willamette Valley than it is up in Washington. And so that's going to be useful for you. It's going to be a little more cool, a little more humid. The plants aren't going to get as stressed. Maybe you won't get as much blossom end rot or sun scald. And then here is a growing degree day model. This is for New Girl tomato. And basically, what it's saying is that because it's warmer in Corvallis, we get our tomatoes a little earlier. So the model is saying August 4th for us and August 20th for Duval. This might be a little off. I don't know when you actually get your fruit, and we can talk about that at the end. But that's another thing to think about when you're thinking about site suitability. Is this crop going to mature in time for me to be able to market it? And understanding that for your site is super important. So another thing about site suitability is we found that tomatoes actually exhibit terroir. So on certain sites, the plants get more stress, they get more blossom end rot, but they also have sweeter fruit. So yeah, so tomato flavor intensity is affected by site. And the mechanism for this is actually different from grapes. With grapes, the ideal site, you get moderate stress, moderate vine growth, limited nitrogen availability. And for tomatoes, it seems like the sites where plants are more stressed, they have smaller fruit, more blossom end rot, and higher flavor intensity. And we're actually hoping that next year we'll be able to look at this more with site suitability studies looking at terroir. Variety selection is super important. Really depends on what you, the growers, want. Early Girl is super popular, and these posters are available too. Lane had these made, and to market the tomatoes. So Early Girl super popular, and this is mostly because of that flavor intensity. It gets blossom end rot, but it's super flavorful, and so people like it. Um, Another thing we've done a lot of experiments with is grafting the tomatoes. So we'll put these tomatoes onto these really drought resilient rootstocks like DRO141TX and Fortamino. I don't know if any of you have grafted tomatoes, but basically these rootstocks, they're interspecific hybrids between the tomatoes that we love to eat and then these like desert wild tomato species from, South America. And these rootstocks, they're really drought resistant. They're really good at getting the moisture. And so you get higher yields and less blossom end rot if you use them. But you also get lower flavor intensity because the plants aren't as stressed. So there's kind of another conundrum for growers that relationship between stress and flavor intensity. Some of the projects that we've been doing here, one that might interest all of you is we've been doing variety trials in collaboration with the University of California, Santa Cruz, looking at yield, flavor, and blossom end rot resistance. One of the varieties that I know that you all are going to be growing in the trials is Dirty Girl. So you can see that compared to some of the other varieties here. So what we found for Dirty Girl at the OSU Vegetable Research Farm, which I should say is one of the best places in the Willamette Valley to grow dry farm tomatoes because it has the perfect soil. It hasn't, it's a really good site. 21 tons per acre. Um, the amount of that we considered marketable was 14 tons. Really low incidence of blossom end rot, but pretty high incidence of other blemishes. And this was mostly that yellow shoulder or green shoulder issue. So if you have a hard time selling tomatoes with green shoulder, then Dirty Girl might not be for you. Um, and there's lots of these blemishes. Um, I got a chat. I'm going to check it really quick. I looked up the ideal pH for watermelons, 5.8 to 6.6, and muskmelon is 6 to 6.8. So thank you for doing that, Amy. And then another thing you can see in this figure too is that difference between the grafted and ungrafted tomato. So Early Girl versus Early Girl on Dro, pretty much a doubling of the yield. Why aren't you going? There we go. Another thing we tested was the flavor intensity of these varieties. And so we had a big taste test. Again, you can see Early Girl, the most popular one, 3.9, but not too different from some of these other varieties like Estiva, Cherokee Purple, and Big Beef. Dirty Girl was kind of at the end of the pack as far as flavor, except for one variety, and that was Frederick. And Frederick was one that I was really excited to try out. We had done it in 2020, and this variety is super resistant to disorders, to blemishes, but it has that even ripening gene. And so I think that it's predisposed to having really low flavor intensity compared to other varieties. And so I was happy we were able to trial Frederick again because I knew it had these other really great qualities, but the flavor intensity just isn't there. And so I think that we don't have to trial it anymore. Um, some of the other trials we've done, we did tomato variety trials from 2020 to 2022. And two of the varieties that we trialed then that I know you are all planning to trial were Tiffin Mennonite and Azoichka. And we can see here, Tiffin Mennonite has really high yields, total yields, so 32 tons per acre. Azoichka was 29 tons per acre. Um, the Tiffin Mennonite, though, it had pretty high levels of cracking and gold top, or yellow shoulder, but it was pretty resistant to blossom end rot. And so that's one reason why we recommended these varieties is because they were so resistant to blossom end rot. But they have other issues. Tiffin Mennonite is pretty late maturing, and they have these other blemishes, and they don't taste as good as early girls. So, I haven't been recommending them to growers down here as much. Another thing you might be interested in growing are these European hanging tomatoes. These are these really long-lasting tomatoes. They last into the winter, um, and they're traditionally grown in Italy and Spain and Portugal using dry farming practices, which I think helps them store even longer. So the growers basically they go out when the tomatoes are mature, they pick them in these little clusters, and then they hang them in these things. In Italian, they're called ristras, I think, or maybe that's the Spanish word. But they're, basically they you can see that these two people are picking their tomatoes and they're putting them in these ristras and then they're hanging them from the roof. And there might be a lot of market potential with these varieties. They're it's a lot of labor, I think, to put them in the ristras, but we have a really easy time selling them at events because they're very striking. And we're gonna do some trialing of them this year and do like a focus group in the winter to see which ones taste the best. And Uprising Seed actually carries a lot of these, and a lot of them are open pollinated varieties, so they might be something that you're interested in growing. We've had a lot of successes with marketing these tomatoes. I talked about Anthony, $1 price premium for the dry farm tomatoes. We've been working with farms to sell them to retailers in Portland, and these retailers sell them for $6 a pound, which is wild to me. But for me, tomatoes are free, so I can't imagine spending any amount of money during the summer on tomatoes. Um, Other farmers have begun to develop like a little bit of a cult following for these tomatoes. One of my farmers in Oregon told me about this experience where she's had customers coming back again and again to get them over the years. And then this picture is from a dry farm tomato sorbetto. There's this sorbetto maker in Portland who wanted to do dry farm tomato sorbetto. And I think this really demonstrates that there's a lot of different like niche market opportunities with dry farm products, whether that's maybe canning or processing or making passata or doing sorbettos. Like there's a lot of interesting experimentation that's happening. As far as melons, this is also another poster that Lane made. Some of the varieties that we recommend, I think there's a lot more melon varieties that are appropriate for dry farming. Some of our favorites include Lily, Crenshaw, Arava, Gallia, Lambkin, which is a Piel de Sapo, and then Charlin, which is an ananas. A lot of the varieties that we recommend, though, are F1s. I know that for this project, you're really interested in using those open pollinated varieties where you can save the seeds. We recently came out with an extension pub on our dry farm melon work. This includes identifying high performing varieties, evaluating yield, splitting, and fruit quality, evaluating the effects of grafting onto flexifort rootstock, um, planting density, and planting dates. And then we also evaluated some of the highest performing varieties on multiple sites. So you can see not just how they do on our really great silt loam at the Vegetable Research Farm, but on other sites as well, where they tend to do a little more poorly. So from that extension pub, one of the varieties I know you all are going to be trialing is the Eel River melon. So this is a Crenshaw type. Crenshaws are among my favorite, and it did pretty well. The total yield here you can see is 13.5 tons per acre. Um, at our site, it seemed like the melon yield was really dependent on the average fruit size. And this might be different on other sites where you have more pollinators. So I think that the more pollination visits you get, the more fruit you get set, and they might be a little smaller, which is ideal. But at the Vegetable Research Farm, at least, we find a really strong relationship between yield and fruit size. And an issue we found with the Eel River was a lot of splitting. So it says here 63% splits. This may have been because we were only picking twice a week, but I do think that some of these open pollinated varieties are a little more susceptible to splitting than some of the F1s. Another variety that you all are going to try is the Blacktail Mountain, which we also did. And this one did really well, 18.6 tons per acre, very little blemishing, and then a pretty good size. So average fruit size is really important. I had a farmer who said that people don't want big watermelons anymore because they don't have big families anymore. I think it's easier to sell these smaller, people call them ice blocks watermelons. So yeah, Blacktail Mountain I think is a good one to try, and it's early too, which is important. All right, how are we doing on time? Am I good to keep going? I'm just gonna
Keep it
assume so.
going.
All right, we're gonna keep going. So a little bit about planting stock management. I start seeds in early April. A lot of things, if you look online, people say you want really big plants that you start really early and then you put in a big trench and you plant them. I don't think any of that is necessary. Um, if you want to learn about grafting, we have a grafting website. But for me, like the planting stock that I aim for is short, stocky, with a healthy root system with lots of little white tips. These tomatoes here, they're really tall, they're chlorotic, they have the stress flowers on them already. This is not the ideal planting stock. So, and some people would say, oh, you just plant them really deep, and that's fine. But the more time you spend growing your plants, it's going to cost you money. It's time spent in the greenhouse, and it takes more time to plant them if they're super tall like this. I'll get into planting in a little bit. With melons, your choices are to either use transplants or to direct seed. Transplants result in earlier fruit, they're more expensive to produce, and they potentially have better establishment. Direct seeding, in my experience, they tend to be a little later and it's a little cheaper because you don't have to do the manage them in the greenhouse. But the plants also seem like they're healthier. Like I feel like they have less issues um, throughout the growing season. So you can see here, this is a little trial we did. We direct seeded these melons in the middle of July on ground that we never irrigated. We didn't pre-irrigate or anything. We just kept the ground nice and clean, made sure we cultivated off all the weeds. And then we furrowed down to the moist soil and planted in that moist soil. And everything emerged. We planted so late that we didn't get any fruit off of them. But it was fun to see that like you can plant really late as long as that ground is moist. And I would say that maybe the best thing to do for growers would be to do both. If you do transplants for your really early succession, and then maybe do direct seeding for those later successions when the soil's a little warmer. For soil management, we recommend farmers use cover crops. I know certain publications recommend using fall applied compost and amendments. I've always done amendment applications in the spring and it works well for me. We see an effect of those applications. We recommend growers prep the soil early, but not too early. So if you prep early, you remove that cover crop that's going to potentially take that residual soil moisture from your main crop. But if you go in too early, you might compact the soil, negatively affect soil health. And so hopefully we're going to do more trials of like how does the cover crop termination date affect dry farming. That's part of this proposal that we just submitted yesterday. Here you can see one of the growers we're working with. They're working in filberts here, but we use this implement in our trials. This is a chisel plow. So we like to go down about 9 inches with the chisel plow and basically use that to break up any surface compaction. And then we go in with a power harrow, which has these like vertical teeth that go down and spin so it doesn't compact the soil. And we recommend that growers do this soil prep in a real shallow way because the deeper you till, the more you aerate the soil and the more residual soil moisture you lose. So you don't want to go too deep when you're prepping the soil or tilling. We want you to control weeds. Weeds are your number one enemy when you're dry farming. Weeds take moisture from the soil, they compete with your crop, and they can, cause crop failures. And so, the two things I see small growers not doing that they should be doing when they're dry farming is they're not liming and they're not weeding enough. And so, yeah, for me, I have a no weed tolerance program. Some people try mulches. I've found that mulches can actually negatively affect the crop. So this is from a soil management trial we did in 2020. We're looking at tomatoes. We put down this beautiful leaf mulch, 4 inches. Took a lot of work. We brought in about 20 yards of leaf mulch. It took us hours to put it out. And basically, the tomatoes used that leaf mulch as a fertilizer. There was residual nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium in it. The plants got really, really big. They set lots of fruit. All those fruit were really small, and they had lots of blossom end rot. And so, yeah, these basically mulches, at least with leaf mulch, it can basically act as a fertilizer, and it can cause your crop to grow luxuriously. And with tomato, at least, that is an issue because blossom end rot is associated with plants that have too much early season growth. Yeah, we recommend that farmers use fertilizer, use spring applications of organic fertilizers, and while this in most cases won't affect yield, it will affect blossom end rot and it will affect flavor. So the more fertilizer you put down, you get more blossom end rot, but you also get sweeter fruit. And this is because the more fertilizer you put down, the bigger the plants they set more fruit and somehow it makes them a little more stressed and they set, so they have these more blossom and rot, but they also have more intense flavor. And so what I recommend growers do is if you try growing dry farm tomatoes and you find that the flavor isn't as intense as you would like and you don't have a lot of blossom and rot, you might want to consider, using fertilizer application is kind of like an accelerator. Like I'm gonna try to put down a bunch of chicken manure or something to try to bump that flavor up. And I know I'm gonna lose a little bit to blossom end rot, but it actually also affects yellow shoulder. So the more fertilizer you put down, you also get less yellow shoulder. And so that can help, it kind of balances out. But if you put way, way too much down, then you can get lots of blossom end rot. As far as planting, you want to plant when the soil temps are right, sometime between early May and early June here in the Willamette Valley. If the soil surface is dry, you want to just furrow down to the depth of the moist soil. You want to be planting in the moist soil. You don't need to like do a 2 foot deep trench though. You just get to that moist soil. It's not going to be too far down. We were able to do it in July, so it's there, and you just have to believe in it. And you can plant by hand. You can use a planting tube or a tractor transplanter. I don't think any of that really matters except for what works best for your farm. And then for tomatoes, we recommend 7 feet between rows, 18 to 24 inches in row spacing. This seems to work great for us. We don't trellis, so that way we can get a picking tote through. It's not totally all over the place. But planting density actually does affect blossom end rot and flavor as well. And we'll get into that here in just a bit. And then a couple days after you plant, we pulled this tomato plant up and you can see new roots are growing into the soil. So it only takes a couple of days if the soil temps are right, the soil moisture is there, and the plant is already working its way into that native soil. A really great book if you're interested in how to control weeds with implements is the Steel in the Field book. It's free on the SARE website. Weeds is the most important goal of dry farmers when it comes to floor management. And there's a bunch of different tools you can use. Some people use a rototiller, some people use sweeps or side knives. I mostly use a wheel hoe, and that works fine for me. That might not work best for everyone because I know that can be a lot of labor to send someone out there with a wheel hoe, but um, another project that I've been working on is this blossom end rot toolkit. So basically, we're trying to find ways that growers can control blossom end rot for dry farm tomatoes. And we tested 5 different treatments. So one of them we did was sheltering. We had the hypothesis that blocking the wind could prevent blossom end rot because that wind stresses the plants out. And we did find that planting these shelters, so this is a sorghum shelter belt, and this is the control plot. And so you can see, we have our two different wind logs to see the difference between them in wind speed. So using this sheltering, we saw a 14% decrease in blossom and rot, which isn't a lot. It was a small but statistically significant effect. It also resulted in an increase in sun scald. And I think this is because uh, somehow the plants were increasing the temperature of the air around them. Um, and the other issue with sheltering, you can only block the wind from one direction. And if you're using a shelter belt crop like we did here with the sorghum, it's really only effective at the end of the season because it takes about until August for the sorghum to get tall enough to block the wind. And other crops don't work as well. We've also tested sunflower, we tested field corn, um, and sorghum really seems to be the best for blocking the wind. We also tried this wind screen, which blocked about half of the wind in this plot. And again, it was pretty similar. Even though we got to install this in June, we still saw just kind of a small decrease in blossom end rot. And for this, we definitely saw an increase in sun scald. The fruit that were closest to it, a lot of them had sun scald that was obvious just by looking at them. And I think that's because, the black of the fabric, it absorbs that heat and re-radiates it out and increases that temperature, and so you get more sun scald. Again, we tested these amendments. So putting down more chicken manure results in that increase in blossom end rot. It also decreases the average fruit weight, so you get more blossom end rot, smaller fruit. You get more soluble solids in the fruit, so the fruit are getting more intensely flavored, and you get less yellow shoulder and sun scald. So again, this is something that I think growers should experiment with as a way of managing blemishes and flavor in their crop. And then we tested planting density, and I don't want to get into this too much, but basically the past 2 years we've done these like double density trials where we went from 20 square foot of plant to 10 square foot of plant. And there's really no effect that we saw across 6 different farms 2 years in yield or unblemished yield. The fruit were slightly smaller if you planted them at a higher density. There were more fruit at the higher density per acre. More blossom end rot in the 10 square foot of planting, less yellow shoulder, and then more sugars, increase in soluble solids. And all these were statistically significant effects, but they're small. And so I don't know if this is really worth it. You're spending twice as much money on planting stock, and you're not really getting much of a return for that. So I think that maybe the best planting density is about 15 to 20 square foot of plant. That seems to be ideal. And then we also tested pre-drought stressing the seedlings. And so we had these ones that we let get really, really dry. The idea was that we would basically, these plants would be pre-adapted to dry farming, and there was no effect. So whether you irrigate them every day or you irrigate them every 4 days before you plant them, it doesn't really seem to affect how they perform in the field. And then finally, we tested trellising. We actually thought that trellising would increase blossom end rot because you're elevating the plants and they're in the wind. It didn't have that effect, but it did increase yield and it reduced sun scald. And I think a big reason for this is if you let the tomatoes sprawl, then the vines will crack, and this will allow sun to intercept the canopy and into the fruit. And so I recommend, if you can afford it, you might want to consider trellising to increase your yields and reduce sun scald. And then finally, this is my last slide. I think we have diseases and pests. A big issue that I've seen with dry farm tomato is powdery mildew. It seems to be worse in dry farm crops than irrigated crops. This is a photo from California. You can see it's everywhere in this field. This can negatively affect flavor, so definitely a big issue for dry farmers. And we've been trying to use inoculants to control it. I don't know if this works. I haven't tested it in a controlled trial, but that's what we've been trying out. Another issue we see a lot is symphyalins. These make it so that the dry farm crops don't get established. So I don't know if you all know about the potato test. Basically, you cut a potato in half, leave it on the moist soil overnight. You come and look at it, and you have these little white thread-like creatures on it. You got an issue with symphyalins, and they seem to be pretty common on organic farms in Oregon, at least. Oh, here's the profitability piece. So we did this enterprise budget for dry farm tomato production. It's a lot of numbers. This is actually in the extension pub, which is about to be published on dry farm tomato production, so you can look at it more closely there. I think the big things to take away from this is that, first of all, if you're dry farming, you're going to spend less time weeding. So we spend about half as much time weeding the dry farm plots as the irrigated plots. Um, you're going to spend less time harvesting because there are lower yields. And so, depending on the size of the harvest, you're going to be spending less money on labor to get those tomatoes harvested. But in the end, um, you actually end up spending more for dry farm tomatoes because the yield is lower. And this is really dependent on what that yield is. So if you have 6 tons per acre, here it's saying that, it's going to cost you about $1 per pound of tomato, whereas 18 tons per acre, you're at about 50 cents per pound of tomato. And so, that's why you really have to think about your site. You have to think about your management practices and ways that you can mitigate this risk because there's a lot of variability between, farms in their yield and that affects whether or not they're profitable. This is the final slide. I'm sorry, I've gone on a really long time. I think it's important to think about the future of dry farming in the Western United States. A lot of people, they believe that dry farming is going to be a solution for climate change. But unfortunately, this is the vapor pressure deficit in the Willamette Valley well, in the Western US. So this is the 30-year average. And then this was, I think, 2018. And you can see it's a lot hotter, a lot drier. We had lower yields of all of our crops. We had more blossom end rot in 2018. And I think that this is the future. This will be the 30-year normal in, 50 or 100 years. So is this even going to be sustainable into the future without, learning more and investing more in research and in my work? I don't know. But it's definitely something that I'm concerned about. And sometimes I joke that I should really move to Medford and study dry farming there, because then, in 50 years, they'll have better data for the growers of the future. And this is also an issue in California. This is a really long quote, but basically the farmer here is saying that they're using irrigation to simulate their historic rainfall events, that they used to be able to rely on these spring rains to help water in their plants, and now they have to use their irrigation to simulate those rains. And that might be part of the reason why dry farmers in California are beginning to redefine what dry farming is, because they can't do it the way that they used to without using any irrigation. Now they're starting to use irrigation, and uh, so that's it. Thank you so much to everyone who's worked with me, my collaborators, my inspirations, my farmers, my students, my funders, and I guess I'll open up for questions. Great.
Hey, um, okay, so around here, it's very normal for pretty much everyone to grow tomatoes in a high tunnel. Um, and I I was just wondering if well, okay, we grow tomatoes in a high tunnel without irrigation every year. But like I said, this is at a sub-irrigated site. Um, do you suspect? I suspect that it'll be different here than there. Um, I'm just wondering if you can give me a little more insight into how well, if this might work, um, growing the tomatoes in a high tunnel up here in Sequim, Washington, which is very similar to Port Townsend, very much in the rain shadow.
Yeah, this has been an interesting question, and it's really something we should look into more is can you dry farm in a high tunnel? I know that, from my perspective, if you're dry farming, you're not irrigating, and if you have a high tunnel or a bunch of high tunnels, then it might be difficult to re-moisten the soil every year, because, you're relying on those rains to actually intercept the soil and percolate in and maybe you could simulate that again with irrigation. If you pre-irrigate the soil, try to get it saturated over the winter, and then you can plant into it. I really don't know about dry farming in a high tunnel and whether it's possible. Um, There are other issues with high tunnels too. You can end up with increased levels of salt in the soil, and there can be weird nutrient imbalances. And these are also a result of the lack of rainfall, at least down here in Oregon. Does anyone else have any perspective on dry farming in a high tunnel?
I just wanted to
And I,
offer one thing. Just a lateral. I don't know a lot about the ability of soil moisture to move laterally, but I know that I've seen adjacent areas wet. Those kind of like rails where they can move. I don't know if you can hear me or not. My internet connection is a little spotty right now, but yeah, the ability to uncover or kind of the high tunnels that you can actually move the frame over. So I wonder if there might be some opportunities there.
yeah, I guess the ones that we usually grow these in, we take the covers off every winter. So going into the season, the soil is very damp. Okay, I have another question. Unless someone else has more information about high tunnels in, climates with very cold summers. I'm so curious about that melon flavor anomaly, where the melons taste like, what did you say, metal or meat, or any
Yeah,
idea what's causing this? Is it soil? Is it genetics? Is it something else, or like microbes? Or it seems so bizarre.
so melons, they're called volatile organic compounds, and they're the aroma compounds that give melons their musky smell. And it depends a lot on variety, what they produce. There's I don't know, terpenes or whatever different types of aroma compounds there are. So that depends on variety. It depends on the maturity of the fruit. So as the fruit matures, the aroma compound molecules will change either in their expression or they'll physically change. Um, and this results in a bunch of different interesting flavors. Really love melons for their diversity of aroma compounds, and you can get things like, orange or apple or pear or all sorts of, oolong tea. I actually tried to spend some time recording all the different aroma compounds that I tasted, and I put them in that extension pub. I don't know what they are that are causing the off flavors, but it's definitely in the ones that are musky, like cantaloupes and Charente. And I don't know if it's the stress, if it's more of an issue with dry farming, if that somehow changes what volatile organic compounds are being expressed and how much. And, the same volatile organic compound will express differently even depending on its concentration. So something at, 10 parts per billion might smell like rose, and at a million parts per billion, it'll smell like asphalt, or something like that. So these things are really dynamic. Um, and yeah, it's just something that I think growers should be aware of. And some of them, the organic compounds, they can become like unpalatable. And that's really what I think growers should watch out for. And one thing that we included in our extension pub was we noted the varieties where we tasted these off flavors. And they definitely were a bigger issue. Like for one we tested was Sugar Cube, and I wrote down that it had these off flavors in 22. It was one that one of the people we were collaborating with, organically grown company, was really interested in because it's like the perfect size, the perfect market class, and they really liked it. And so the next year I tasted every single one that we picked to make sure that it didn't have any off flavor. And that year, 2023, we didn't have any off flavors in any of them. So it could have been a result of the climate or the soil or the interaction between the genetics of the plant and the environment. Um, and it does scare me because it's something that I can't predict. Like I can't tell you what causes it but anyway.
Hey, Matt, I
Thanks.
think we're just at time, but if we have maybe one more question, and I know this is a perfect opportunity to ask questions, so I apologize for not giving us enough time.
Yeah, and you can always email me too. So
Okay, thank you.
chat.
I I do have a question if anybody minds staying a little bit longer.
I mean, I can stay as long as you guys want or need me, but so
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to stick around. This is so cool and very exciting. So um, I'm happy to stick around and learn some more.
Cool. Well, I have one sort of thought or question about Catherine's question about doing greenhouse, like dry farmed tomatoes in a hoop house. If you're taking the plastic off, once you put plastic back on, could you not put down like a plastic mulch or a landscape fabric or something to sort of keep retain soil moisture and then plant into that? Um, and then,
Yeah, I think that that's fine. I don't really think that soil moisture evaporation is that big of an issue. Like I was saying, we had that soil that we planted in July, where the only thing we did was we occasionally like cultivated it to keep the weeds off. And that first maybe 6 inches or 4 inches
yeah.
got dried out, and then when you got below that, the soil was moist. And so I personally, I don't necessarily believe that growers need to bother with mulches in order to get the same results. It might have a marginal effect. I know that Anthony uses landscape fabric for his dry farm tomatoes, and I think it's mostly to control weeds. Um,
Well, I think that it also when the fruit is if you don't trellis them and the fruit's on the ground, it you basically you reduce the amount of like seconds that you're gonna get because they're sitting on a surface that isn't gonna like blemish them or there's not gonna be like bugs damaging them from below.
yeah, for us, I've never trellised. I mean, I did the experiment where we trellis, but I usually don't trellis. And in my experience, the dry farm tomatoes don't get as many
Just moving
blemishes,
them.
even if they are rubbing against the ground, because you're not irrigating them. So it's not like they're sitting on dry dirt. It's not like really biologically active. They're not, So, but I take your point. Yeah. Uh, I wonder too with the landscape fabric because it's dark, it might cause more sun scald because it's like absorbing heat and re-radiating it, similar to what we saw with the shade cloth that we not shade cloth, but the windbreak cloth that we used. Um, so but maybe Anthony can talk about his experience. Like, why do you use landscape fabric, and do I know you do landscape fabric on some, and then others you don't have landscape fabric. Do you see any sort of effect?
Yeah, we do. We have some good pictures of the side by side of landscape and not, and it's pretty noticeable. But we also use it just to like heat up the soil a little bit. But I can't really speak to the sun scald because we didn't take enough of the we just didn't have enough of the really enough space to try any side by side without them. But yeah, we're big fan of landscape fabric. Also just from like the weeding aspect. It's once we plant it, we just never have to weed it.
Yeah, I guess that's one thing I didn't think of is that landscape fabric could I mean, could heat up the soil, and maybe that'll make them grow faster.
I'm curious about your experience transplanting into dry soil and you're not irrigating or anything even at transplant with tomatoes, correct?
I mean, like I said, if I mess up the soil prep, I will. Like, you don't want the soil to be, if there's dry soil and you furrow down and that the soil's still dry, then you're gonna have to irrigate to establish your crop. Because as long as you can plant into moist soil, you're fine. And you just have to get down to that moist soil. Um, and if the soil's dry, then it has to be moist to plant. Like,
Yeah. Do you have you experimented at all with like using a bed shaper or a something that actually compacts the soil so that you're firming it up and you get more like capillarity in the soil before planting?
no, not really. Um, yeah, I don't know much about the capillary action stuff. I know people talk about it, and that's why you want to like dust mulch or something. And we tested dust mulch versus a clean cultivated control. With the dust mulch, we were using a rototiller. The idea is that you create this sort of like insulate the vaporization plane or whatever. You till it, and then you're preventing evaporation from the sort of capillary action. And we didn't really see any differences between the dust mulched and then the one that we just did with a wheel hoe. Um, and I think, and Amy here is saying clay soils will shrink, swell, and crack, exposing more soil surface so that it can increase moisture loss if the soil is not cultivated or mulched. I think that the big thing that growers, the reason why you want to have the soil surface be loose isn't necessarily because it's going to prevent evaporation, but it's because if you let that soil dry out, the surface, it gets really hard and then you can't weed, at least not with a hoe or a wheel hoe. And if you weed with maybe with a rototiller, it's gonna create a big dust cloud. So I think that the best thing for growers to do is to get in early after it's rained when the soil's still moist and cultivate, very shallow, either with a rototiller or with a wheel hoe, just to like loosen that surface up. Not only will that kill weeds, but it'll dry it out. And so no more weeds will germinate. And then if you want to go back later and weed again, it'll be so much easier. Uh, so
I have a question. I'm curious if you've seen any research about straw, like straw mulching, and how that, whether it has an impact on, if it has the same impact as the increase in fertilization.
yeah, I think not. I think that straw mulches or bark chip mulches would probably be more appropriate because you're not creating this big source of nitrogen for the crop. And we recently had our winter convening. We had a grower from Sicily, a real old timer, dry farmer, practicing this like ancient cultural tradition for him. And he mentioned people using mulches, straw mulches, and things like that for their dry farm crops. But he really made it seem like that was something you could only do on a small scale, because it's just so difficult to spread that much straw out over so much ground and trucking it all in. And for him, he was basically saying the same thing that like you just want to keep that surface soil loose, that you know. So that you can easily get in and cultivate it. But again, I don't think that soil moisture evaporation is that big of an issue and is something that growers should really be worried about.
Yeah, I know in
Amy might
Iowa.
have some interesting info on using a roller, which maybe she can answer his question better than I can. You want to talk about that, Amy?
Yeah, I was just mentioning that when I was down in California in 2015, case studying dry farmers, they were using that roller method and they were tilling, but they were in a really unique context on the Eel River with really deep silty soil that had a bunch of silt deposited in the 64 flood. So sorry, I'm gonna have to hop off here because my office mate, we share office, is in a meeting, but I just wanted to add that. Thank you.
Yeah, I was just going to mention with the straw thing. Um, so out in Iowa, we never irrigated. Like I remember going out there, and I came from Oregon, and I was like, how do they not irrigate anything? But they don't. Uh, and we did straw mulch with tomatoes, and then we did uh, black fabric, landscape fabric underneath our melons. And um, I remember that there were some disease issues with the straw and a little bit of maybe too much moisture. Um, but that's why I'm curious. I was curious and interested to know if that practice is done elsewhere. So cool to hear that it's done in Italy. But yes, we had a crew of 10 people and it took us forever to get all that straw down.
Yeah, and like I said too, I do think that the number one goal of floor management for dry farmers is controlling weeds. It's not, like trying to prevent evaporation. And I
Mm.
don't think that evaporation is that big of an issue. I could be wrong. And maybe the reason that the dry farm tomatoes that Anthony grows on landscape fabric is because he's able to get an extra inch or two of soil moisture, and that would make a difference. Because the yield of your crop is highly dependent on the amount of moisture that's available, whether that's at 6 inches or whether that's at 6 feet. The other thing that having the soil moisture staying moist at the surface that could really help with, now that I think about it, with a dry farm crop, is that most of the soil nutrients are at the surface, in that first 6 inches or so. Like phosphorus, potassium, these things aren't really found in the subsoil. So with dry farmers, you're really farming that subsoil because you're growing a crop that's going to root deeply. That's where your moisture is. If you have a some sort of um like a mulch, whether it's plastic or landscape fabric or straw or leaf, those 6 inches might stay moisture longer, and so that's more nutrient availability and nutrients are available longer. Um, So Nia is saying, how much or how often should we water and still consider dry farming? For me, don't water at all. For other people, water once or water twice. For other people, irrigate up to fruit set. There's no dry farming police. I think that as far as other farmers go, if you're growing tomatoes and you're calling them dry farmed, and if they taste like crap, then I think the other growers, they might get mad at you because you're hurting the sort of like dry farmed tomatoes have a really intense flavor brand. Um, but there's no dry farming police. For the purposes of this trial, I don't know. That's up to Kayla and Susan.
Yeah, yeah, I can jump in on that. So, basically, in the protocols we wrote to do one irrigation set like after you transplant, just to water them in. That's what we've done in the past at OSA for other dry farm trials. So, obviously, if you start, the seeds in a greenhouse, you can definitely water your starts and then just, yeah. If you also can skip the initial, watering after transplant if you think it's wet enough at your location. But I think we'll probably plan to do like one watering at transplant. And, depending on your irrigation setup, the timing will vary, but we'll probably end up doing like a 4 hour set on drip, depending on the weather and the soil moisture. And we're just moving the farm this year. So the soil's a little bit different than what we're normally working. So I'll kind of just see it, once we get to transplant time. But yeah, you can definitely do an initial watering if you would like. And then after that, ideally, yeah, cutting irrigation. We could always check in, if like you're about to have a crop failure and you still have drip down, you could always, do maybe minimal irrigation. But I was thinking we could kind of figure out as a team how we want to kind of make those calls. But yeah.
I wanted to just chime in too and just say that when you guys get to the point where you are like selling tomatoes at market or you're putting them in your CSA, we do have like marketing information to help you communicate this to your customers. We have, like you saw some of the posters. We have another one that's just purely about dry farming. We've got a zine that I popped in there for you. We can print some of those. You can use the PDF. We have descriptions, illustrations, all these things that will help you to communicate the benefits and the improved flavor of dry farm tomatoes to your customers.
So Nia says enough irrigation to keep them alive. I would want to point out that I've never seen a dry farm tomato die from not being irrigated. This I had a grad student who planted these tomatoes, and these plants were huge. They had a small little, they were in like 4 inch pots. The plants were like 2 feet tall. She planted them real shallow. She didn't water them in, and these plants, they looked miserable. The leaves are all sagging. They look so sad. And I was really happy because I thought this will be the year I see a dry farm tomato die. And they didn't. They bounced back and they produced fruit. And I was surprised, and kind of sad because I really wanted those photos to be like, this is why, planting stock matters. This is why you don't want to have a huge tomato plant with a small root system, you can't get them established, but these plants are so resilient. And then, with the melons, the 200 cell flats that we do, these like deep flats, I do worry about those because the plants are so small. But when we direct seed, when the plants are they don't, if they emerge, then you don't need to irrigate them, and they make it. So yeah,
You're living into the reputation of the worst thing to a farmer is a happy researcher on their farm.
yeah,
Means death.
right. Yeah, I always get mad if I don't get enough blossom and rot. Like, why am I even here? You know. So
Awesome. Do we have any last questions? We're good. Jason gave it a thumbs up. All right. Well, you do have Matt's email. Thank you so much, Matt. This was amazing. Yeah, this was awesome. Thank you so much for sharing all the pertinent information that we can use as we're moving into our trial period. Really quick, I wanted to remind everyone of one thing, and that is the location, if I could get it, the location of our trial team folder. And there you can find your trial protocols, data sheets, meeting notes, and some of the experimental design information. I'll drop that in here. And then if you have any questions about that, here we go. And you all should have access to this already. Oh, hi. And if you have any questions, feel free to, I'm gonna just tell you to email Kayla. And that's Kayla@seedalliance.org.
Yeah, and feel free to reach out if I think everyone's gotten their seed. I know, Naya, I'm going to be sending you another package today and some more melon seeds to Patrice. But if anybody else needs more seeds or has any issues there, definitely reach out. And yeah, I think next month we'll have our next trial call and I'll send out info for that as well. And then we can all kind of check in and see how things are going. But yeah, I think that's it for me in the meantime. But yeah, definitely feel free to reach out if you need anything from me.
Thank you everyone for coming. This was amazing.
Yeah, thanks so much, Matt.
Thank you, Matt.
Great. Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Care.